The Cold War. Decades of shadowy and not so shadowy competition between two great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Everybody knows that America won. Communism is a fringe ideology even in communist countries, and while Russia is trying to claw its way back to power, it's struggling to take control of its own backyard. While America loses wars too, we lose wars on the other side of the whole planet. That's like if Russia invaded and occupied Bolivia for 20 years. But that raises an interesting question. What if America didn't win the Cold War? What if the Soviet Union won instead? Well, this is what, why, how, and that's what the video's about. If you like this sort of thing, subscribe and check out my Patreon. Okay, back to business. When you look at the Cold War, it might kind of seem like an even match, but to be frank, the game was rigged from the start. The Soviet Union was never truly competitive with America, but even then, it did land a few punches against Uncle Sam. The difference is, the US survived those punches. When the Soviet Union fought its own Vietnam War in Afghanistan, it shattered apart. But all this history could have gone very differently if we rewind back to the fork in the road, the Great Depression. Now, in real life, President Roosevelt won in a landslide election in 1932. His ambitious New Deal policies, while not perfect, kept the US from the brink. But this wasn't inevitable. Early on, the frontrunner in the Democratic primary was the candidate from the last election, Al Smith, the former governor of New York and a Catholic. Al Smith lost against his popular successor, FDR, and never stopped hating him for it. But Al Smith, who had plenty of party insider support, could have triumphed over Roosevelt in the primary if he jumped in earlier instead of procrastinating. It also didn't help that he made abolishing prohibition a key issue instead of just focusing on, the Great Depression. So let's say that happens. Al Smith wins in 1932 over his old rival, Herbert Hoover. What then? Well, Al Smith was a lot more centrist, pragmatic, and less visionary than Roosevelt, so the government response to the Great Depression would have been a bit weaker. With unemployment remaining kinda high and the economy plunging back into trouble like it did in real life, Al Smith barely wins re-election in 1936. Meanwhile, Europe and Asia explode into war. Germany invades Poland, Japan invades China. You know the history. With Smith's handling of the economy a failure, the Dems lose in 1942 Robert A. Taft, a senator from Ohio and the preeminent isolationist in politics. Taft shrugs off demands to go out of his way to help Britain, France, and soon the Soviet Union against Germany. When Japan invades and occupies European colonies like Vietnam, President Taft shrugs it off as Asia's problem. He refuses any sanctions and continues to sell them oil, so Japan really has no reason to attack America. With no lend-lease from America, the Soviet Union is knocked to the ropes by Germany. The German army captures Leningrad and the red capital of Moscow, but Germany's supply lines across Eastern Europe are just too long and vulnerable. The German army, month by month, starves and freezes. Despite the Führer's orders that any retreat will be punished by death, the German army crumbles. With titanic effort, the Soviet Union wrestles back Germany and kilometer by kilometer retakes Eastern Europe. In 1947, the Red Army crosses into Germany and takes Berlin. Within a few months, Paris and Rome raise the Red Banner too. So entering the 1950s, the world is vastly different. Europe lays in ruins, but the Soviet Union straddles the continent and puts into power a dozen different communist regimes. Asia is dominated by Japan, but the military there is running on fumes after bleeding out in its struggle against rebels in China. And America, a lot poorer and weaker than real life, is the underdog in a new global Cold War against communism. In 1952, the US elects Hubert H. Humphrey, a progressive senator from Minnesota. Humphrey targets workplace discrimination and racial segregation at home, but he really doesn't have too many gripes about adding nationalist dictatorships like Portugal and Spain into the new Anglo-American anti-communist alliance, the London Pact. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, tightens its grip on Europe. The new chairman, General Zhukov, seizes industrial products from Germany and uses extensive forced labor to reconstruct Eastern Europe. That's how the Soviet Union recovers from all the devastation Germany inflicted. This leads to famine for the Germans, with hundreds of thousands dying, but prosperity for the Russians. In Asia, the Japanese army is slowly starved and bled by guerrilla fighters. The Soviet Union, seeing this weakness, finds a convenient excuse and plunges for the throat. In a merciless campaign, the Red Army wipes up the Japanese army. While the Soviets can't match the Japanese Navy directly, they can use a new wonder weapon, the atomic bomb. Nuclear bombardment wipes up the Japanese Navy, and in 1956, the Air Force drops 2 bombs on Japanese cities. Japan raises the white flag, and after the Red Army occupies, the red banner. Meanwhile, the Japanese puppet states in China, Indochina, and Indonesia crumble in the face of communist revolutions. The bloodshed across East and Southeast Asia is immense. The East goes red. This disaster, of course, cost Hubert Humphrey the election in America. He's replaced by the Republican Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who's much more aggressive on foreign policy. Lodge directs large sums of cash to anti-communist forces across the world, including fascist groups in Europe. The Soviet Union, of course, has its own espionage service too, the KGB, which sponsors communist coups and revolutions in Venezuela, the DR, and Cuba. Meanwhile, the European colonial empires in Africa finally crumble. Most new governments express ideological sympathy to the Soviet Union, of course, but they're basically run by pragmatic strongmen. Now, the communist bloc isn't completely unified. For example, when the new Soviet premier, Khrushchev, distances himself from the personality cults of his predecessors, Mao and a couple other communist leaders are enraged. But since America cannot project its power into the Eurasian landmass effectively, these communists never really directly confront the Soviet Union. While America has plenty of difficulty stopping the dominoes of communism, it does develop and test its own nuclear weapons, but it's far behind the Soviet Union on missile technology. In 1957, the USSR launches its own man-made satellite, Sputnik. In 1960, the American President Lodge wins re-election on a hardline anti-communist platform, but in 1961, Lodge is assassinated by a gunman. Conspiracy theories abound. The youthful Richard Nixon, the new president, points fingers at the Soviet Union since the gunman spent time there. Domestically, Nixon oversees a major crackdown on leftists across the country, with the FBI arresting thousands of people across the nation, including major civil rights leaders. In the midst of this crisis, an American spy plane discovers Soviet nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba. With the drumbeats of war growing louder, Nixon imposes a blockade on the island and demands the Soviet Union stand down. But the USSR knows that American missile technology is too far behind to make a serious dent against the Soviet Union. When Soviet ships charge the blockade, America blinks and withdraws. Nixon and the US are deeply embarrassed by the Cuban Missile Crisis, which adds to domestic instability. In 1964, for example, President Nixon is challenged by the centrist Republican governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, while the Dems are also split between the progressive John Kennedy and the conservative George Wallace. No candidate wins a majority, so the election goes to the House, where Nixon narrowly wins by cutting a deal with the Southern Dems. In the Soviet Union, on the other hand, Premier Khrushchev leverages this foreign policy success to implement needed reforms at home, including profit incentivization for economic enterprises. While the USSR in a vacuum is not really economically competitive with the US yet, it essentially climbs atop the back of its colonies in Europe and Asia to stand nose to nose with Uncle Sam. But it's getting taller. Beginning his second term in office, Nixon is out for blood. He expels the Rockefeller Republicans from the party and puts into power his own guys. Nixon then directs the FBI to dismantle the Democratic Party piece by piece by airing their dirty laundry. JFK's affairs, for example, are leaked to the press. When journalists uncover the dirty tricks used by Nixon during his re-election campaign, the president goes after the newspapers in a campaign of harassment and intimidation. With the civil rights movement so far unsuccessful in pressing the conservative presidents to address segregation, activists turn to radical solutions, beginning a series of violent attacks against the government. In 1966, Black Panthers break into the Capitol and assassinate 10 congressmen. This begins the American Years of Lead, with the Nixon administration secretly aiding radical groups like the KKK and violating the Constitution thousands of times over by basically assassinating anti-government leaders or imprisoning them without trial at the US military base at the Panama Canal. Plenty of peaceful leftists get swept up too in this new Red Scare. Meanwhile, Congress passes a new Sedition Act that basically censors anything but the mildest criticism against the government in the name of strengthening Fortress America and American capitalism. In 1968, President Nixon opts to run for a third term. While breaking norms, there is no formal rule saying he can't, since nobody has so far. In the general election, he strategically, politically, and emotionally crushes the Democratic nominee by using his usual dirty tricks. In foreign affairs, Nixon goes on the offensive against the Soviet Union. He meets with Mao Zedong and formalizes relations with Red China, then meets with the French premier and does the same with Red France. In the Middle East, Nixon provides aid to Islamist groups to challenge the pro-Soviet puppet governments. These Islamist radical groups then go on to spark civil wars in Lebanon and Iran. The quicksand pulls the Soviet Union into a religious war. Nixon also devotes huge sums of the federal budget to competing with the Soviet Union in the space race. But the American program faces several hurdles. Nixon's aim of landing on the moon by the end of the decade passes, with the Soviets growing ever closer. The swelling federal budget, alongside other economic issues, leads to prolonged economic stagnation in the 1970s. Premier Khrushchev, in his elderly years, steps down from power in 1970. The throne passes to his anointed heir, Alexei Kosygin, a reformer who prioritizes increasing the Soviet standard of living rather than inflating the military budget. To do this, he furthers Khrushchev's economic reforms, including greater decentralization and liberalization. While the Soviet Union experiences economic issues in the 1970s, just like America, it begins to catch up with its rival across the pond. In 1972, Nixon gracefully agrees to be renominated. The Democrats get some additional votes when, in the months leading up to the election, Soviet cosmonauts land on the moon and plant the red banner, winning the space race. But Nixon wins his election again. And in 1976, of course, he wins again as well. America has become what it created in the Cold War, an illiberal, authoritarian dictatorship. In the mid-1970s, Islamist revolutions flick over the dominoes of Iraq, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. Immense violence occurs as the Soviet Union struggles to maintain a fragile grip in the Middle East. In 1977, Premier Kosygin finally throws up his hands and withdraws with his tail between his legs. While America hopes this marks the end of the Soviet Empire, these wars ironically help the Soviet economy by wiping out a competitor in the oil market. President Nixon does not learn from the mistakes of the Soviet Union. When the pro-American governments in Colombia and Nicaragua face revolution from radical communists, he sends in the troops, overextending America's military capabilities. But in 1980, the world is shocked. Both President Nixon and soon Premier Kosygin drop dead. In America, Nixon's successors scrabble for power. The new president, Spiro Agnew, only lasts until 1982 before he's forced out of office by a corruption scandal. George H.W. Bush, the vice president, takes the throne next. In the Soviet Union, on the other hand, the party chiefs coronate the young Mikhail Gorbachev, who promises to continue the reforms of his predecessors and to finally bury capitalism. While Gorbachev attracts foreign investors and brings the Soviet Union closer and closer to overcoming the American economy, the U.S. Army is dragged into exhausting jungle warfare in Colombia. Communist guerrillas receive aid from Cuba and of course the Soviet Union and begin to raid American-held territory in 1984. In that year's election, Bush is thrashed about by a primary challenge from the arch-conservative Pat Buchanan. A nuclear disaster in Pennsylvania, which nearly poisons the whole mid-Atlantic, doesn't really help his election chances. In the general, the Democratic Party nominates Jesse Jackson, a civil rights leader who calls for America to withdraw from war and implement much-needed reform at home. Jackson rallies African Americans and young voters and, in a surprise twist, topples President Bush. In January 1985, America inaugurates the first Democratic president in 30 years, and of course, the first African American president ever. Jackson struggles, though, with the bureaucracies of the executive branch and the old guard of Congress, which drag their heels when he proposes progressive policies. He does, however, reform the FBI and throws out the Sedition Act. This allows all sorts of new dissident political groups to blossom. In foreign affairs, Jackson extricates America from the jungles of Colombia. That means by 1987, most of Latin America is red. Premier Gorbachev in the Soviet Union also implements liberal reforms. The two leaders shake hands and promise a brighter future. In 1988, Jackson runs for re-election. The Republicans nominate Pat Buchanan, but leftists, centrists, and fascists nominate their own candidates too, because they sense the weakness of the political system and hope to seize power. Pat Buchanan and the old Nixonite news apparatus rile up Americans across the country, by prophesying a communist takeover if Jackson wins again. Violence, of course, escalates. Militia bands, for example in Utah, begin attacking federal agents. South Carolina, meanwhile, threatens to secede if Jackson wins again. In D.C., tens of thousands of protesters occupy the streets, with the military dispersing them only with reluctance. On Election Day, voters across America are split across the major candidates, but when Jackson starts to inch ahead, several conservative states freeze the vote count or use other means to block Jackson's victory. Jackson threatens to use the military to force the states to respect democracy. America is on the edge of collapse. It's about then when several high-ranking Pentagon chiefs, who've been chatting with the Buchanan campaign for some time, begin to implement what they believe is a last-ditch effort to stop communism from taking over America. As President Jackson oversees this legal battle from the White House, a specialized task force enters the building, tells Jackson there's a threat to his life, and rushes him to Air Force One. Airbound, Jackson finds he cannot communicate with anyone on the ground. His captors then present him a piece of paper, a letter of resignation already typed up, ready to sign. The message is clear: get out while you're still alive. Jackson, in the face of an obvious threat against his life, signs the paper. Next, the Pentagon chiefs present Jackson's letter of resignation to Congress. Power then transitions to Jackson's vice president, Ted Kennedy. But with the deadline for the new presidential inauguration inbound, the winner of the election itself unclear, and the Union about to explode, Kennedy calls for a new constitutional convention to reform the U.S. government. But this opens Pandora's box. Texas passes a bill declaring its secession from the United States, South Carolina follows, then a series of states one after another. President Ted Kennedy desperately tries to hold the country together with diplomacy, but with the military in basically a mutiny, he has no ability to actually get anything done. The Union ends not with a bang, but with a whimper. The Cold War is lost. But history doesn't end. In the 1990s, the United States struggles with complete economic and political collapse. The old republic is done away with, and a new single-party state, the American Union, is created. All parties are done away with, too, except for the new Institutional Progressive Party, with Ted Kennedy as its emergency head of government. Economically, the Union welcomes in Soviet planners. In 1992, America implements its first 5-year plan. Major swaths of the economy are seized by the government, while the prices of things like food are regulated by the Central Planning Commission. This is, of course, a complete disaster. Unemployment, crime, and the black market skyrocket. While the dissolution of the United States was mostly peaceful, war is inevitable. Civil wars quickly begin in several southern states between black nationalist communists and neo-Confederate fascists. With the help of American soldiers and international peacekeepers, new pro-communist multiracial governments come to power. These soon become highly corrupt dictatorships. But the instability also spills over into America itself. When separatists take control of Oklahoma City, the American government bombs the city to ruins in a message to any further secession. In 2000, Premier Kennedy hands the reins of power to his chosen successor, David Petraeus, the darling of the military-industrial complex. Once in power, Petraeus sets off on a slow mission to challenge the Soviet Union's supremacy over the entire planet. America cooperates with the Soviet Union's rivals, including China and Brazil, and gives guns to troublemakers like Argentina and Turkey. Petraeus also brings violence to America's backyard. When North Carolina makes moves to join the Soviet Union's alliance, America invades and occupies key cities. This alienates Southerners. In 2014, for example, Texans overthrow their pro-American government. In retaliation, Petraeus invades, snatching the city of Dallas. However, the American army slows to a stop on the highways of Texas. The Texan army, soon armed by guns gifted to them by the Soviet Union, and their own weapons of course, stops America in its tracks. 10 years of trench warfare beneath the hot Texas sun begins, but today in the Soviet Union, the will to keep sending billions of rubles worth of military aid to Texas is drying up. So, the future is uncertain. But what do you think will happen? Will America reunify and begin a second Cold War against the fading Soviet Union? Will war break out between the great powers? Why don't you comment below to let me know? And why not support the channel on Patreon, because for $1 a month you can get your name in the credits, like user SEQ, Marklin, Sheba, Skinny Meme Dude, Caliber, and Lehan Whale. Adios.